Welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, John Harney. This month we are discussing Far Cry Primal, the latest iteration in the Far Cry series. Developers Ubisoft chose to set the game in the year 10,000 BC, which immediately piqued our interest here at History Respawned. We were particularly excited when we realised we would have the opportunity to discuss the game with two academics who worked directly on the project, specifically in the creation of two languages for the game, Winja and Isila. Both of our guests are from the University of Kentucky. Dr. Andrew Byrd researches the historical study of Indo-European languages and the language from which they derive, Proto-Indo-European. Dr. Brenna Reinhart Byrd is a specialist in German language and linguistic studies, and has written on resistance vernaculars in Turkish-German hip-hop in contribution to the Cambridge Companion to Hip-Hop. You can find both of our guests at the Twitter account @SpeakingPrimal, and their accompanying blog speakingprimal.blogspot.com, where they regularly post on the Winja language.
Smarkaka.
Mu Andrew.
Mu Brina.
Dwadangwa Far Cry Primal Teachamas.
Welcome, Andrew and Brenna. Thanks very much for that.
Thanks for having us.
That basically was, we're Andrew and Brenna, and we created two languages for Far Cry Primal.
Yeah, and we're really thrilled to have you on History Respawned, and this gives us a chance to talk about it. So I kind of have these ideas written down for myself for us to talk about. I guess before we get into Proto-Indo-European itself, which I'd really love to hear more about, do you mind talking a little bit about the process and how you guys went about this? And our viewers can look up. There's a couple of good articles I can include in the description of the mechanics of being invited and stuff. But
Sure.
how long did this take you? I'm really curious to hear how challenging this was, or rewarding, or these are the things I'd love to hear about how it went.
Yeah, so they contacted us at the very beginning of the stages of the development of the game. So this was towards the tail end of the development of Far Cry 4. Right, so we were on the project for most of the time. Yes. And yeah, it was definitely challenging. Of course, we had never done anything like this before. We realized very quickly that the scale of this project was huge. Right, so it was bigger than they initially just asked me to do it. It was bigger than me. It was bigger than the two of us, and so we actually talked to three of our friends from graduate school if they could come on, help us develop the languages, and help us with some of the translations.
Yeah, it was actually really interesting. I mean, I think we they contacted Andrew initially, and we both just kind of looked at each other, and I think there was only like 30 seconds where we were thinking that he would do it by himself. It was kind of like, no, I want in on this.
Well, at the beginning, we didn't know how big this was going to be.
It could have been like...
So they were flirting around with the idea of having kind of a 13th Warrior type situation, where these guys are sitting around a fire.
Have you seen 13th Warrior?
Yeah.
The movie adaptation of Crichton's...
Movie
adaptation of Crichton's Eaters of the Dead novel.
That's
right.
With Antonio Banderas as the Arab. It's one of my favorite movies.
Yeah, so they're sitting around the fire, and, the guys are speaking Old English. And, slowly we see that the Arab is...
Yeah, so basically, so it's supposed to be the Ibn Fadlan character, but it's Antonio Banderas. He's like sitting around the fire with all of these Vikings, and suddenly the more he drinks, the more a word will turn into English, and another word will be English. And by the end of the night, because we all know this is how learning languages work,
right?
By the end of the night, he understands everything in Viking. So originally they were like, oh, that worked well.
Yeah, they thought that idea was cool, so we weren't quite sure how much Proto-Indo-European there was going to be. But when they were like, all right, the whole thing, the whole shebang is going to be on.
So that was their call.
Yeah.
They came to you, so you weren't necessarily kind of hinting at it or saying it'd be great. They made the call completely on their own.
Yeah,
that's why
initially I was
us.
very skeptical that this was going to be possible.
Wow.
Yeah,
just because of the size of it.
Yeah, but that's so. I mean, Andrew's been contacted before to do the one or two occasional words. There was like a soundtrack.
Yeah, so you might know this guy's name, Christopher Tin, who did the Civilization 4 soundtrack, Baba Yetu.
Oh, okay.
Won a Grammy. Well, he did this whole album about water, and each song is in a different language, and the first song of the album is in Proto-Indo-European. It's got various words for water, different inflections and things like that.
So we kind of thought that this might be like that, whereas it takes about an hour to do or something like that. And but then the more we looked at it, the more we realized this is going to be a huge project, and so we And the initial stages also, I mean, we developed prototypes, and the prototypes were different than the languages we ended up with. So we had to pitch. We actually had to translate a scene from Far Cry 4 into our prototypes and have them figure out what that was. And we were there with the casting of the actors. We cast them actually through Skype because if the actor couldn't work with us and couldn't do the languages, but we cast before we started casting actors before we settled on the languages completely. Like I remember.
So part of the casting, it was a test for the actors, of course, but it was also a test for us and for the languages, right? So they had to give their feedback on how easy are these languages to speak. Is there anything in particular you would change, right? And most of the actors are like, no, it's good, right? But
I mean, okay, yeah,
they're pitching for a job, I guess, to a certain
extent. Yeah, no. So there were a couple people who didn't get work because they basically said,
one guy in particular was like, this is impossible. You cannot do this. And we're like,
he's like, it's close enough. He kept saying that. It's close enough. I'm like, okay. But no, one of the main actors actually was one of the first people we Skyped with, Cara Ricketts,
Sila.
Yeah, she's Sila, the Gatherer.
Great.
She's also really famous on the Canadian stage right now because she just did Head of Gobbler. So she's Gebler. Yeah, Head of Gebler. Yeah. But yeah, she's
amazing.
She's amazing. So she was, but she was one of the first. I did a Skype session with her, and just to see if she could do it. And so we worked back and forth on just pronouncing things. And I'm so glad that she did a lot of it because she was fantastic and really. I mean, these are serious stage actors that worked. A lot of very professional people that they brought in for the project
And her character is really important, especially early in the game. Like, she's really kind of hooking you, the protagonist, into what's going on here, and she kind of remains as the fulcrum of settlement and everything.
She's really the first human face in the game, right? So you have, what's his face? Dalsu. But, I mean, he basically, it's a wonderful scene, but for me, that's like the first point in the game where you're like, wow, I'm a person talking to a person, and we're doing things that people do.
With Sila?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
I've already won the game once, and I'm playing it again. I'm playing it on expert mode with no HUD.
I've been reading about that, and that's been tempting. That's actually a question for you guys too to just bring up real quick. I mean, we all, as video game fans, we all like read interviews of video game developers and everything, and I feel like obviously every developer has a different experience of the game making process, and you guys obviously were part of the development team in a pretty what's what I'm looking for here. Pretty integral way, right? Yeah, exactly. So how is it affected, even though you're talking about individual characters and stuff, because you're obviously have a very close relationship with the script, right? Very close. Yeah. So, I mean, what's that been like? Because I think a lot of the time we talk to developers, talk to writers, even talk to coders, for example, and graphic designers and stuff. What it's like for an academic to be invited into that and to be a part of that process. That's really interesting.
Yeah, no, I mean, it was really fascinating. And honestly, it was really interesting. We would get into conversations in the break rooms about just, what does it mean to what is the deeper meaning of this scene and what exactly is going on here. With Aisha, who plays Jaima, we really got into some conversations about her as her expertise and her worldview and the worldview of the Ouija and all that kind of stuff. But to get back, like, what is it like? I mean, this is one of the things. We were there on set throughout the entire filming because they needed somebody to make sure that they were saying it right, and so we saw everything. We were there when a scene would change. We would run with the directors and the creative team and the writers and the actors. We would come up with stuff, and so we had our fingers in so much of it, right? And there's one scene in particular, and I mean, maybe that's why for me the opening scene is so important, because I just remember doing the scene, and it was a hard day. It was a hard couple days. We actually the cliff at the beginning, when they're going up to look at the mammoths, and Dalsu, your buddy who dies, right? He's like, looking, hey, go this way, you go this way. That cliff was plywood held up with some metal bars on scaffolding. And they had to rebuild it. Like, they shot the entire day and it wasn't working. And so they had to redo it. And the director footage just like, I'm really sorry. Oh, and he was like and everybody was emotional about it. Like, with this whole day. And we had this great Shakespearean actor, Ethan from Stratford. And he had come in specifically because he's the Dalsu character. And he'd come in and he's the one that you hear, Suwan Brashtar. That entire scene, there's one part where one of the motion specialists, the coaches, motion coaches, Roberto, he played the role of the mammoth. Mm-hmm. So the actors were lying on the ground in this open studio. And it's an interesting kind of thing because everything's CGI other than the people. And so then Roberto he's got his hands up above his head. He's holding them, is trying to make himself as big as possible and stomping as if he's a mammoth in time. And then they're like, they're looking up really slowly. And it's just this, they're imagining him as the mammoth. And we all started to see him as the mammoth there in the studio. We're all imagining Roberto. Like, we got all serious and we're watching him like he's the mammoth, right? And then, we see the actual CGI, and it was goosebumps. It was so neat to see it.
I think the initial scene is amazing.
The initial scene was just like, and then the tiger, when the tiger jumps in, that was one of the funniest parts of filming. Like, all of that was just the funniest. They got this one stunt guy, and they did an emotive performance to capture the feelings of it. And so an emotive performance is basically, you don't do any lines, you just yell out what you're feeling. Mm-hmm. And so the guy who plays the tiger jumps up and he's like, I'm an effing tiger. Of course,
and after a while, they
I'm gonna eat you, and everyone's like,
They start doing it in Wenja. They're like, how do you say that in Wenja? I'm like, Mufu Pausi Contigri. Like, all right,
yeah.
Mufu Pausi Contigri.
Yeah, it was really funny. It's just, he was scary too. He was really intimidating, just getting up. He'd jump up, and he must have shouted 100 times that day, I'm a bleeping tiger! I'm gonna bleep and eat you! And we're like, oh my God. And it was really funny, but then it was also really terrifying. So, it's magical. It's really magical to see the scenes that you've worked so hard on that are, they like transform into this other dimension. It's like through the looking glass. You're so suddenly these things that seem so real and yet completely different, they get transformed into a cave somewhere, and it is this person it's completely the scene that but it's also just in a dreamlike state. It's, I don't know, it was really, really fascinating.
Yeah, very cool. We'll come back to it in a second. I think this idea of Ubisoft's kind of commitment to Wenja and everything as well. But it's great to hear that the actors were like, yep, all in. How do I say that thing I just said in Wenja? That's fantastic.
Oh, yeah. No, so one of my favorite people in the world is T.C. Carson. I love this man.
So the shaman.
The shaman.
Oh, right.
I love Teen Science. Yeah, no, TC is awesome. And he worked so hard. He would have his lines, he would memorize all of the lines, but he also wanted to have the lines in literal translations of English, which doesn't make sense to anybody. This is like linguistics, like English, hand with, mouth open, for, like completely gibberish unless he learned it all. He had it all typed up. He memorized every single thing. He wanted to know exactly so that he could push the words that he wanted. And he would sit there. He was so worn out at the end of the day, but he always did every single one of his scenes in the language. He didn't even want to try doing it in English. He came in, he did it in the language, and man, he worked so hard. Like, that was it was really hard work on all of them, definitely, but he was committed to doing his scenes like in the language from the start. Like, he would go in and be like, I got this, and it was but they were like that. That's kind of, thinking about it. They were also, like Deborah Wilson, the Battery, the Zila Queen, which you haven't seen yet.
Yeah, you don't know yet.
Yeah, but you can see the trailers. She's the blue painted woman.
Right.
And she started giving her dogs commands in Azila. She was like walking around the streets of LA, like yelling in Azila. It was hilarious. She really got into it. They were all just super. I mean, everybody was into it.
That's great.
It was really fun.
Yeah, that's great. And like that comes back again to this idea, of immersion. But we take a step back for just a second as well. And what I wanted to ask you guys about, so Proto-Indo-European, I see it gets shortened to PIE in written. Is that, you called it PIE? It's curious.
Used to, I was adamant, no PIE. No,
oh, really?
Now I say
So I'm curious, and I'm sure our viewers would love to hear more about Proto-Indo-European and how Winja and Izila, am I pronouncing those correctly?
So Winja and, if you want to say it in Azila, it's Hisilach.
Oh, Hisilach, okay.
Hisilach.
I'm curious to know about Proto-Indo-European and how the two languages evolved from Proto-Indo-European, or how you guys obviously crafted and evolved those ideas. And then some of the sub things that I'm personally interested in, are these languages that are mutually intelligible, and is that something that's worth thinking about or not? How does Proto-Indo-European, what's the relationship to the languages, for example, the language we're speaking right now?
Yeah.
And this is kind of an interesting, kind of a culturally loaded question, sub-question. Is Proto-Indo-European more limited than modern languages in kind of the things it can express, the ideas it can convey? Those are some of the things I'd love to hear you guys talk more about.
So let's start with the next to last question. So
which is the next to last question?
The one about English.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So English is one of many languages spoken today, and there have also been many languages spoken in the past that are related in that they all go back to the same language, right? So if you look at the history of English, the history of Spanish, the history of German, French, Hindi, Russian, Farsi, there's just hundreds of languages where 5,000 to 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, these languages would have been dialects of the same language, right? And what happened was, as these guys migrated across Europe and throughout Eurasia, they stopped talking to each other. And when you stop talking to someone, there's no reason for the languages to be the same anymore. So these differences started to develop, differences in sounds, differences in words, and things like that. And we see new languages are created in that way. Now, in terms of how does Proto-Indo-European relate to Wenja and Azila, so Ubisoft asked us to create two languages for the game that were based off of Proto-Indo-European. Initially, we had pitched Wenja to be just Proto-Indo-European. But when the development team had heard the language, they're like, that sounds really modern. And there's a good reason for that, because if you listen to Proto-Indo-European, it sounds a lot like Latin and Greek. For obvious reasons, because Latin and Greek are Indo-European languages, right? So they're like, okay, that's not going to work for Wenja because we don't want it to sound so progressive, right? So what we decided to do was to use something called internal reconstruction, which is a methodology used in historical linguistics to turn back the clock on a language. So we already had Proto-Indo-European. Let's see if we can create Proto-Indo-European. And the result was Wenja. But if you listen to Azila, that's actually Proto-Indo-European, more or less. There's some simplifications, but more or less.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, and that's one of the things with so Proto-Indo-European sounding modern. One of the things that you have to deal with any kind of adaptation is, of course, the expectations of the audience. And when you're talking about authenticity, it has to also be an authenticity that feels authentic for the audience, or else people won't buy it. And so it's funny because, Proto-Indo-European, this ancient language, would feel too modern for the time setting for a lot of people. Even if we can think of Proto-Indo-European being even as far back as 7,000 years ago, maybe not, but still, like there's some people who can place it back then. 7,000 BC, not 7,000 years ago.
No, 7,000.
7,000 years ago? Okay, sorry. So yeah, so there were a couple things that we were working with, but then there was also, they did want to move the game to 10,000 BC because. And they weren't sure originally when exactly the time frame would be. And so when they decided on that, well, we would have had to reconstruct things back further because Proto-Indo-European is not supposed to have been in that time period much.
A lot of it depends on your point of view.
Right, there's that too.
So most Indo-European linguists believe it was spoken about 5,000 to 7,000 years ago in between the Black and the Caspian Sea. So today it's Ukraine. But there's some scholars, most of them are not linguists, but some scholars, archaeologists mainly, who actually have proposed that the Indo-Europeans originated out of Anatolia, and the spread of Indo-European as a language family coincided with the spread of agriculture. Now, today there's good archaeological evidence and most notably genetic evidence that suggests that's wrong. That if you actually look at the change in the gene pool within Europe, it coincided with the introduction of the Indo-European languages, and that happened about 4,000 years ago. So it's pretty clear, I think, that it wasn't spoken in Anatolia, but at any rate.
Yeah, no, and so that's one of the things is Ouija was supposed to be the Proto-Indo-European, and what he's talking about with internal reconstruction when you're trying to figure out what's an earlier stage of the language. For example, everybody talks about English being a Germanic language, and most people don't know what that means. Well, that means that the oldest parts of English, these older roots, mirror things, or they come from things from an earlier stage of a Germanic proto-language. And so, for example, how do you know when something's older? Well, the things that we use every day usually don't change as quickly. Things that we don't use every day, I don't know. What's the plural of, there's an example, syllabus. People are like, is it syllabuses? Is it syllabi? Professors who use syllabi all the time usually say that. Syllabante. See?
Syllabantes.
Right, that would be the correct.
It's news to me.
Right,
I just made a face. People don't know.
Right. That's what it should be, but we use it all the time. We have decided it's syllabi, right? Based on whatever cactus, cacti, right?
That's
in Texas,
exactly
right?
Yeah.
So, but then the things that we don't use all the time, they're more subject to change, like syllabus. But the things that we do use all the time, sing, sang, sung. Bring, brang, brung, no, but some people will do that, but brought, these kinds of things, they go back if you compare in German. So sing, sang, sung, drink, drank, drunk, singen, sang, gesungen, trinken, trank, getrunken, bring, brought, bringen, brachte. It's the same older pattern. And plurals like man, men, man, männer. It's the same kind of thing that you see, and these are older forms. They're older ways of doing the plurals. They're older ways of doing verbs. This is the kind of pattern that you can use to say, well, let's imagine if all of the verbs did that. Then that would be our older stage. And let's imagine if all of the plurals did this kind of a thing. That would be our older stage. And so that's kind of how you do the internal reconstruction. The point where the question, what you want to say?
Yeah, I just want to give an example of this from Wenja.
Okay.
Oh, right.
So in English, if you look at all the question words in English, aside from how, they all begin with a WH. So what, when, who, right? So they all begin with a WH. And that WH actually goes back to, in Proto-Indo-European, qua. Because if you look at the question words, for example, in Romance, many of them begin with a QU, which in Latin would have been pronounced as a qua. So like quis is who, quid is what, quade means why, and things like that, right?
Quid pro quo.
Quid, yeah, exactly.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. And so what we did was we said, okay, that QW means question, right? So what we did was we said, what if the syllable ku was just how you made a question? So in Wenja, to say, you speak Wenja, you say Winja Wadhata. If you say, do you speak Wenja, you say Ku Winja Wadhata. No, you don't go up in inflection. The way that you mark the question is with the ku, and that's been kind of extrapolated from the quis and quid and the what and the when and things like that.
Fascinating.
There's a famous line from Sila, ku chlawata. And it's like
Tanhichlawata.
Ku tanhichlawata. Ku chlawata.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, do you hear the screams? Do you hear the And it's that ku again is that. So it's also optional in Ouija because some things are understood obviously as questions. But yeah, whenever you want to ask a question, we put in the ku at the beginning. And Jaima actually, she has this kind of when she asks something or she says something with a sentence starter, either an oo, which an oo is the command, like, okay, it's kind of like putting an exclamation point at the beginning of the sentence, you know, or putting a question mark at the beginning of the sentence. The oo is the command and the koo is the question. But she does it kind of like from her gut. It's like oo and koo, right? She has this kind of
Yeah, that was really important for us, that we had a language that made sense as a language, as a natural human language, but also one that each actor could find their own voice within. Right? So if you listen to Jaima's pronunciations, for example, she calls takar mammoth feet, which within, say, my speech, within my Wenja, it'd be mammoth padi.
Okay.
And she says mammoth padi. It doesn't matter though, because there are no vowels within Wenja, and we never told her to do that. She never, consciously thought of it, but she gravitated towards that pronunciation, and it works great.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Each of the actors has their own special idiolect. Like it's fascinating. So, and it works really well. But they all we got them together and trained them. Especially those the tribal members, so that they definitely have a tribal distinction. So the Udam speak the same language as the Wenja. It's just like a different accent, different dialect kind of thing. And so we would get them together and make sure that they mirrored. It's like, okay, now you say this line. Okay, now you repeat it back. Let's figure out where we can sound the same. And but I want to get back to your question, which is really it's specifically a very interesting question for the history of linguistics, this concept of a limited language or a primitive language. This is a controversial topic within the history of linguistic anthropology. Some people call it the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, based off of Whorf, especially his things that he had published. Benjamin Worf, not Worf on Star Trek.
Not Lieutenant Worf.
Yeah,
right.
No, a different one.
That's Worf's first name apparently in Star Trek.
Yes, Lieutenant.
According to me.
So this idea of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis or linguistic determinism is some of its. There are a lot of myths out there about language and culture and society. The famous one that Worf reported on was in the case of the Hopi, the Native American Indian. They had different ways of expressing time. And he wrote that meant that because they didn't have different tenses, like a present, past, future tense, that they weren't able to conceive of the past and the future. However, it seems he just had a really bad translator. And I use this actually example in my classes when I teach about this. In German, you don't use a future tense to indicate the future. You use a present tense of the verb. You don't do the present progressive like we do. We say like I'm reading this right now, not I read. In German, you do kind of like I read now, I read tomorrow, I read every day. There's no distinction in the verb itself.
Chinese does that too.
Yeah, well, a lot of languages do, right?
Classic example.
And it doesn't mean
right.
that they can't conceive of a future, right? It has it's not that, right? And so there's this. That's kind of it's a misnomer. That has occurred, especially when Westerners have, Westerners, I mean, Hopi or West, huh? When dominant cultures have encountered cultures that they already perceive to be more primitive, they tend to label the language or interpret the language as more primitive, even when that language might be more rich in other ways.
Right.
So the basis that most people say, yes, there is no such thing as a limited language. There's no such thing as a primitive language, that all languages can express everything equally. However, there's also this other interesting thing within linguistic research that does show that our language and our culture are sometimes so intertwined that the language might actually change the way we see the world. And if you don't have categories for things, maybe that also means that it's not that you're not able to see these distinctions. It's just that they're not important to you.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, they are very presentist.
Mm-hmm.
You live in a very scary world. Everything's out to
Mm-hmm.
eat you. You don't need to talk about things that happened in the past unless they were really important. And then you would quantify it, like when the shaman starts Palumansipa, like many moons ago, right? So then you would talk about things in that sense, but you don't need to say, you don't always need to indicate that something's going to happen or something happened or whatever. It's just, people are dying today.
Right.
They're dying every day.
Yeah, and developing on from that too, like, I really think it was a brave and exciting decision to make a Far Cry game set in like 10,000 BCE, right? Like that's like, wow, like it's not something I think you would have predicted ahead of them doing it, or would have been commonly. I mean, some people would have loved a game. I think we all would have loved a game like that. But for the game to exist as this AAA title and everything is great. It kind of set 12,000 years ago. Agricultural revolution is kind of around the corner. You have this NPC who is kind of innovating, creating things, and you also have Tensai, who's like a shaman essentially, right, or shamanistic at least. He's kind of a witch doctor type figure. That brings on to this idea, like we were just saying there, Brett, a minute ago, about language and this idea of quote unquote being limited or not. How do we though? What do we know about how we developed words for abstract concepts? Like love, hate, sadness, happiness. Because I feel when I teach in my own limited way, teaching East Asian history and stuff, I will talk a little bit about the writing system and things like that. And one of my points is one of the advantages of the writing system was an ability for someone like Confucius to talk about the concept of morality and happiness and have the characters, have the script to convey that to somebody else. But where do these things come from? Is it a false distinction that I'm making between a word for tree and a word for love, for example? And is that how you know what I mean? And how am I right to kind of link it to this setting? Do you know what I mean? This 10,000 BC.
Yeah, I mean, as far as we know, Proto-Indo-European had words for love and hate and all the human emotions that we all have, right? Mm-hmm. They had ways to make abstract nouns, Mm-hmm. I mean, there's specific morphological suffixes, that they added to make abstract nouns.
Right.
So, yeah, for all intents and purposes, it was a human language just like what was spoken today, or what is spoken today. The only difference is there's not a word for microphone, or computer, and things like that, right?
Right.
But of course, there are terms that they had that we don't. Like, when you look through these ancient Indo-European dictionaries, they will, include words. You're like, what the heck is a thill? And you have to go look up what a thill is, Right. But yeah, no, I mean, from what we can tell, it's exactly the same.
Yeah, I have this with my students, being Irish teaching in America, it's like slang, and like, I mean, I can curse in a classroom if I use an Irish curse word, like, well, I feel I can. Maybe I shouldn't be. I mean, there's obviously not me cursing in English either, I guess. But little things like funny little things where it won't have dawned on me that they won't have heard of the word. So one of my father and my favourite one is in certain parts of Ireland. There's two things. There's my grandfather used to love dividing objects into yokes and gozintas. And a yoke is just like, pass me that yoke. Give me that yoke. It's like, give me that thing. Give me that noun. That's what a yoke is. Versus a gozinta is like, a wrench would be a gozinta because it like has a function and does something.
So a tool.
Yeah, like a tool basically. So a gozinta versus, or even a component of something. So we're working on the engine. Give me the gozinta. Give me that part of the carburetor. Versus give me that yoke.
So it's like
give me that thing.
That important thing versus or
functional thing versus just general thing and kind of, and I mean, it doesn't come up that often in history classes kind of thing, but it's just a fun thing to talk to them about because you just mentioned like what's a thill or something. This comes up like even sources, if you're getting your students look at primary sources, and obviously you guys that have similar experiences, even something maybe 30-40 years ago, or just dialects of English that are out there right now where you need to take them aside and go, oh yeah, this is what this means.
To return to Primal, so
yeah, of course.
Well, I took us off Primal, so I appreciate you. That was my fault.
So one of the reactions that we saw, of course, we were following all this stuff very closely when it was announced, and so the teaser trailer came out, and they had words in Wenja, but none of it was translated, and some of the
right.
People are like, what was that? Was it language? No, it can't be language. People didn't speak back then.
Yeah.
And there was this misconception that we saw more frequently than we would have wanted, where people did not have language back then. Right. And one of the great things about the game is this is a really a great way to educate the public, right? I mean, millions of people have played this game, which is amazing for us, right? Played the game, have heard our languages, have probably looked into Proto-Indo-European, realized that, half of the world's people speak an Indo-European language and speak a language that are related to each other. So anyway, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, to really... There was this objective on the development side, obviously, why you guys were brought in, to make the game more immersive, right? Yeah. And I mean, I certainly think that works, and obviously you guys do, right? You're pretty invested in it, but it's such a departure from the the ooga booga type speak, right? That, like, I know that it's been a while since, like, Caveman represented quite that simply, but
I don't know.
No,
well, I guess it isn't. Yeah,
there was a FedEx commercial.
That's
just
true.
A FedEx commercial during the Super Bowl. Where they, like, have ooga booga language.
Yeah, but they, like, do
and
weird,
dinosaurs.
They do, like, weird screams and just all sorts of stuff. No, I think ooga booga is the norm. I think, really, Primal is the first mainstream representation of caveman culture where they portray these cavemen as people, right? As human beings.
Yeah, and when I sit down, the questions I've been asking you guys, like, when I sit down to think to myself, what are the kind of things I want to ask these guys now that I have them here? And things like, talk to you about the language being complex. I want to know where these terms come from. I want to hear these structures. Like, Primal's decision to make that presentation, I think, makes that conversation possible and just introduces the idea. Because I would consider myself a fairly educated person, and I wouldn't necessarily think everybody was basic until we figured out how to write or figure out what the wheel was or anything like that. But still, I had no conception. To the point where, I mean, if I can be a bit more candid than maybe I should be on the internet and say, I went to my colleague, the anthropologist, and double-checked. We did live at the same time as mammoths, right? Because my timeline is completely mixed up now. Of when, Homo erectus versus Homo sapien and all these kinds of things. Like, I'm all over the place. And so for Primal to take that seriously, I think is great. I really do.
It's one of the questions I ask my students, because I made them write about adaptations, and they could write about Far Cry Primal if they wanted to. I said, what is important when you're doing authenticity? How much time and money went into getting us to create these languages for this time period? What makes something authentic, and what is authentic enough, and what is within the realm of artistic license and whatnot? So okay, saber-toothed tiger. Well, that's okay. I mean, some of the weapons.
Like the double bow.
Right.
Sure, yeah.
Or a grappling hook.
The B-bomb, I'm a little, I mean, there's certain things.
The B-bomb has been taken note of.
I was pretty skeptical of the B-bomb at first, but they're really fun.
No, I'm just saying that there's like, but that's my question is what is, quote, authentic, and what is realistic, and even educated guesses are still guesses, and
right.
It's just an interesting kind of thought experiment to what makes something authentic enough to get interest by the public and be bought by the and
literally and metaphorically, or literally and figuratively. Yeah,
like with another series by Ubisoft, Assassin's Creed. I mean, we've got with Assassin's Creed Syndicate, like crawling up to that tower and looking all over London. I mean, it's beautiful. It's so ridiculously accurate and beautiful. And yet they're also like zooming in to these characters from a future, grid, whatever.
Right.
Like, I'm like, what needs to be authentic here? Like, what is the real? And that's, or like even I'm a big sci-fi person, and my dad would always point out, he's like, they shouldn't be allowed to. He's like, they shouldn't be walking. No space. There should be no gravity. There should be no gravity. Why are they walking?
Right.
And I was like, yeah, but it didn't matter for me. But there was other things like how explosions happen. Like there's sound. Why is there sound in space? What is it when we're talking about authenticity? And I think it is really, it's interesting because I feel like Ubisoft took a big risk because the authenticity of Proto-Indo-European and of having intelligent cavemen had to be reconciled with the public assumptions of the authenticity of cavemen as ooga booga, just primates basically out there wandering around bumping into stuff, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, especially as an historian, and frankly, that really informs History Respawned as a series. It's like, where's the line going to be? And I think, you can call it artistic license if you want, and it depends on how you kind of want to look at it. But sometimes something is just cool, and especially there's that balance, like you're just saying. When's it going to reach more ears, more eyes, more brains, whatever, The last thing I wanted to ask you, this certainly, at least I know for Andrew, this wasn't your first time kind of trying to reach out and introduce Proto-Indo-European languages to broader areas. I read on Vice, I think in the interview you did with Vice, that they kind of heard about you because you were recording fables and things like that in original language and stuff. So for both of you as academics, because it's something that really interests me, and again, it's why History Respawned even exists, do you feel working on the game influences your academic work? Obviously your academic work influences your work on the game, it directly informs it, but... And Brenna, we've already talked about this just now a few minutes ago, but what are these connections as academics, right? Especially now reaching, our audiences mostly are not academics for the most part. How do we see those connections? Like, I mean, I'm obviously a very positive view of it. I get the impression you guys have positive views of it too. Yeah. But how is this something that we can use to engage people? And how does our work change when it comes to engaging with people? How do we change the way we present our work? I mean, do we emphasize certain things? These are all the kind of things I'm interested in.
I think I know that my field, my discipline, Indo-European linguistics, Indo-European studies in general, has a problem. Has a problem in that they do not engage the public. Mm-hmm. Every single person that I tell, hey, I'm a professor of linguistics, so what do you do? And I tell them about what I study. They're like, really? English and Spanish were the same language at one point in time? That's amazing. Yeah, why don't you know that?
Right.
And the reason is that my field has failed to educate public on that, right? I think academics in general has failed to engage the public on these issues. And for me, it is absolutely becoming my mission to be the guy who educates the public on these things. And Primal, you can't get a much better platform than Primal for having this finished product that people can listen to and enjoy. And then you start talking to them about, wait a minute, why is the word for water in Wenja wadad? Are you just being lazy? No, actually the word for water in Proto-Indo-European was water. Right. It sounds almost identical to water in Savannah, Georgia, right? Uh-huh. And there's a reason for that. It's because, we inherited the word from water from Proto-Indo-European. So for me, it's very exciting. I hope this project leads to other projects. We certainly have plans for the near future to develop some sort of online way for people to learn about Proto-Indo-European as a language, to learn about its culture, and hopefully get a lot of people who are involved in Primal, the actors in particular, taking part in this project so we can educate. So yeah, it's very important. And this has honestly been my mission over the last 10 years has been about making Proto-Indo-European into something real. Now, I just published a monograph on the Indo-European syllable, and if you look at the whole thing, it's really just me asking the question, okay, we reconstruct this language, Proto-Indo-European. We think it sounds like this. Is this a reasonable assumption? Do human languages sound like that? And that's like the basic question. And the answers that I arrive at always ask, it always is asking that question.
For me, for my research, what I think is really interesting for the project has been, one, just this feeling of, yeah, you can teach any language if you focus on the most important things that you want. Like if you want your students to be able to speak it, if you want to increase their motivation, their ability. I mean, there's different ways that you can teach a language, but you can get people speaking an ancient proto-language if you want to. And that was really an interesting experiment. But also, I've always been interested in representations, in kind of the representations of truths in art, things that commonly held beliefs that we have as societies that then kind of come out in art and that we only realize when they're not our truths, when they stand out to us only when we don't believe them and we go, wait, why is that? And so I find this whole thing very interesting, specifically for the concept of authenticity. And there's certain things about the game that had to be included for this modern audience.
So this question of what is primal was asked every day. Like, okay, this person's going to do this activity. What would be the primal way of doing this, right? And oftentimes it was a reaction against what is modern, right? So you can't point your finger like this with your index finger pointed out like like an English speaker. You have to point it with your all 4 fingers pointing in that direction, right? And silly things like that. But when you play the game, it actually makes the culture feel a lot more real.
Right.
But it's interesting in that it is a reaction against our culture, right? That this thing that is not our culture is a primal culture. And
I mean, yeah, for me, like maybe someday scholars will look at Far Cry Primal the way we look at Tacitus's Germania. Like his version of the Germani was specifically in reaction to Roman society. Like the way he described them was really just an ideal like a like the noble savage. It was this idea that these people are perfect, right? They haven't been corrupted by society. I mean, and so he would describe them in certain ways as completely the opposite of the society that he was in. And are we going to look at the Wenja someday as like the Germani? They're this they're the exact opposite of us, except for these good, very important things that we think are very important. Like they're an idealized, really, the Wenja are an idealized version of ourselves. They're not the evil cannibals. They're not power hungry. They're
just trying to survive.
They're trying to survive. They're good at making friends, but they're also warriors. They're brave. They have strong female figures. They seem to be without gender bias. They're not racist. They're not sexist. They're not. They're like these idealized peoples who can live off the land and work well together and can ride saber-toothed tigers.
Only one of them can.
Right, but it's still like it's an interesting idea of what are our values as a society, that these are our ideal people.
But that's not to say that that's not what it was like.
That's it for this episode of History Respawned. Thanks to our guests, Dr. Andrew Byrd and Dr. Brenna Reinhart Byrd, and thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.